Katie's an investor at StandUp Ventures. StandUp invests in female-led or co-led startups, pre-seed and seed, Canadians only, right? Or Canadians mostly?
Like 70%.
Canadians mostly.
Yeah.
And Katie comes from an amazing health tech background. She was first employee at a startup called Lilia that went through Y Combinator in winter 2020 and is now a wonderful investor based in Montreal. So Katie, let's make our way to the stage. I'll ask you some questions.
Cool. Don't know if I've used, oh, okay.
If you want, you can clip it. I prefer to hold it.
I'll clip it to my scarf. I think I'm just going to hold it.
Amazing. All right, well, we'll start with going through a little bit of like the reality of the market. So I think a lot of the time, especially as Canadians, we're victims of reading sometimes outdated sources of how the venture market is going, or, I mean, the venture market is changing so quickly that frankly, if you read something from 2023 or 2024 about the current state of the market, it's kind of outdated. So I'm curious, what's something founders think is still true about fundraising that just absolutely isn't relative to a couple years ago?
So I would say, and maybe this isn't necessarily about fundraising specifically, but I would say the way that, and I invest primarily in software businesses, so a lot of B2B SaaS, digital health, and marketplaces. The way founders are building today looks very different than the way they were building 4-6 years ago. So I've been investing for almost 6 years, and in the beginning there weren't a lot of AI sort of tooling or different technologies that have evolved to kind of make building and scaling companies much more efficient. And so something that that I've seen is just the overall I guess capital requirements to hit key value inflection milestones is kind of shifting, which impacts your fundraising strategy. So we do a lot of pre-seed and seed stage investing. We'll do rounds somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million for a pre-revenue pre-seed company. And 4-5 years ago, you raised 1.5 million, you start hiring a team, usually a team of engineers, and today we have a couple of pre-seed companies that we've invested in the last couple of years where the CTO just hasn't hired anyone, which is very strange. So obviously that impacts the sort of burn rate for a company, how far they're able to get with the capital that they have, and I think it impacts sort of the fundraising strategy across the board. But then what I would say is on the flip side, you're starting to see different expectations for companies' growth rates from seed to Series C, and so there's almost this interesting thing happening with a lot of AI companies where margins are looking worse because the compute costs are kind of eating into the margins that you typically see in software companies. But then at the same time, you're expected to grow much more quickly. So 3x growth used to be really, really impressive, and now you're seeing growth between 5 and 10x sort of being what the top US Series A plus investors are looking for. So it's just kind of wonky because it's margins look worse, and then growth expectations are higher, teams are much smaller. So those are some things that I've noticed are a bit different.
It's crazy. It feels like 3x growth is table stakes now for a conversation.
Yeah, and it's certainly strange. I would say if you have a strong growth rate and your margins are strong, if you have a 3x with strong margins, then you'll probably be able to get further. And so maybe you'll hit revenue milestones, and that will support your fundraising, even if you're not hitting the 5x or 10x. So there's different ways that investors are kind of looking at the market now. But it's almost like the distribution of outcomes has become a little bit more competitive at at the top of the distribution, I guess, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. And you kind of touch on this, but what does good look like now? Like if a founder walked in or logged onto Google Meet or wherever tomorrow with you, and they started listing off
Google Meet,
like, or whatever we all use, but like started listing off their like key traction metrics or something about their company, like what would get you excited that maybe wasn't getting you as excited before?
Well, one other thing I didn't touch on that is very different from 4 to 6 years ago is because it's so easy to build software now, we're, as investors, and I think as founders, a lot of folks are getting worried about commoditization risk and like just overall moats in general. And so something that we have to think about is like the kinds of businesses that folks are building, like are they well positioned to accrue value into the future? And so it's not just about like, are you able to quickly get customers today? Because in 3 years, everyone might be able to build the product that you have. And so, what was the question again?
What would get you excited if someone started telling you what they're doing or like where they're at?
So just putting it through the lens of like what excites me today versus a couple of years ago, I think founders that are really being very thoughtful about just defensibility into the next 5-10 years, because when you sign up to be a founder, you're not signing up for like a 3-year race, right? Like you're signing up for a really long journey, and most founders who are starting off shouldn't be kind of thinking about the exit in the beginning, and so it's definitely important to be thinking about what does the market that I'm building in look like 10 years into the future. And a lot of the software products being built today are being built for the way work is done today. And so I think something that has become more valuable to us as investors is seeing like really creative founders that have really strong critical thinking ability, because the ground is shifting under your feet, and so you have to be able to have like a point of view on what the future is going to look like, and frankly you have to be right. And so venture's getting a bit riskier in that like maybe the future that you're betting on won't be the future that exists, but having a point of view is important.
For sure. And I would be scared as a founder to pitch you in the sense, because so Katie's a former builder, and Katie's one of the first investors I ever spoke to that as soon as she was thinking about different ways of looking at a company or thinking about different products, the first thing you always think is like, oh, I could build this myself. And you like definitely could build most things. And now we all can build things ourselves with the new tech. So I feel like on top of having an opinion and having a stance on what you think the future looks like, it must be scary to pitch you where you can build all the products that people are pitching you, probably.
I think that helps, though. I spend a lot of time in my boyfriend's in the room. I spend a lot of time building AI tools, random things on the side, and like a lot of my evenings and weekends are spent like kind of hacking around with different things, and it helps because I think from an investor point of view, the bar for what good looks like in terms of like how well you're able to prepare materials, how well you're able to do positioning, how well you're able to build an initial MVP, do user research, everything, the bar is getting higher because the tools that you have at your disposal are so amazing. And so from my point of view, because I'm like playing around with these tools all the time, I get a real sense for like I've recalibrated sort of my thinking around what good looks like. And I think that isn't only like the builder kind of VC persona that's doing that. I think a lot of investors are playing around with tools. A lot of them are using it to do investing better, and better is actually, I don't know if better, but they're, making their jobs easier, I guess, if that makes sense. Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay, so now that we've scared everyone a little bit about the state of the market, I think it'd be helpful for us to give some insights into like how investors actually decide, or what makes investors like kind of lean in or pass on a deal early on. So if you were looking at two companies that had very similar, let's say, seed stage metrics, what are subtle things from the founder or about the company that you could see that would make you lean in or pass? Or even something that you hear in a pitch that makes you nervous. You're like, ooh.
It's not even necessarily what we hear. It's in some ways, I would say, like, because we do pre-revenue investing, we have to really develop our ability to detect what I would call hand waving. And so we invest in a lot of subject matter experts. And so if you're coming from the field that you're building in, you've experienced the problem, you really deeply understand what's going on, oftentimes the unique insights come from like having that experience. And so we recently invested in a tunneling company, so it's like computer vision for tunneling, but they were founders that their previous company was in the mining computer vision space, so it's like geology-based computer vision models. And they would not have come across the problem in tunneling and like the pain point in tunneling that was a little bit stronger if they had not built in the mining space first. And frankly, like the tunneling space is just not super connected with the world of technology. So like a technologist isn't necessarily going to come across that problem either. It takes a really long, like you just have to have so much context to be like, this is a problem that is worth solving in this space, and just have that unique insight that kicks off the company. So I would say, like, in some cases, with the really early stage companies that we speak to, or the really early stage founders, the outsiders can also be great. Like I love outsiders that learn everything they can about a space, but if you are an outsider building, you have to do tons of user research. Like you have to spend hours interviewing your potential customers, and like kind of the Y Combinator, style, like just hundreds of user research
or
interviews.
The District 3 style that Anwal and I preached.
Yeah, so if you're an outsider building, you can absolutely get there. And in fact, I think there's a lot of funds that think outsiders are better for a lot of different reasons, but you don't have that kind of head start. And both of those personas are good, but if you don't understand the space deeply enough, a lot of the work we do is to validate what you know. And if we start to learn from our expert conversations or different folks in our own research with potential customers that what you're saying doesn't totally line up, or there's things you haven't learned yet, then that could be more of a red flag to us, I guess, if that makes sense. That was like a very long-winded way of saying that.
No, that makes a lot of sense. The founders are a big differentiator, but when the founders are almost their own competitive moat of having knowledge or like an intersection of knowledge that others simply would not have, that's a huge
I would say the best is like the combination of those two personas where you actually have the experience. You're coming from the experience, but then you're also kind of what we would call a maze runner, where you're just like also doing tons of user research, always learning, always iterating, always taking feedback, like that sort of thing.
That makes sense. And so we both invest generally, but have a soft spot for health tech, and like a bit of a majority, I guess, in health tech. So what's a health tech specific mistake that you see founders making a lot that a classic SaaS founder tends to not make, or AI founder does not make?
I would say possibly this is a Canadian-specific problem. Canadian founders in healthcare often are trying to approach the Canadian market and the US market at the same time. And I think that when you're starting out, often your initial relationships are Canadian-centric, and Canada will answer your calls.
It's true.
But there are so many nuances of difference between the US and the Canadian healthcare system in terms of the payers, the incentives, the go-to-market sort of that is required to be successful. And so sometimes going after both at the same time really dilutes your focus. Like if you're a healthcare founder and you have $2 million and you're trying to go after two major markets, like that can be pretty challenging. So something I think I've found that works well, and it depends. Like, I think you can build a massive health company in Canada if your market size in Canada is large enough. So, like, typically, like we did a company in the mental health space that focused mostly on Canada. We've also done one in fertility spend. If you're looking at Canadians, overall, it's a massive market in terms of dollars of spend in Canada alone. But if those companies were also trying to go after the US, we'd probably pause a little bit. But we also have a company based in Montreal called Assist IQ. They're doing really well. They just raised, I guess last year, raised a Series A from Battery Ventures.
Nice.
And they sell into hospital systems, and they started with initial relationships in the Canadian ecosystem, and so we're able to develop the technology with Canadian hospitals, and then immediately went to the US. And so I would say that's the benefit or advantage of building in Canada, is like you can have design partners, but really sort of focusing on one of the two markets is probably the right approach. Unfortunately, what that means is that in some cases, healthcare innovation goes to the US before it comes to Canada. So that's kind of the sad reality there.
Yeah, and on the topic of the different markets in Canada and the US, what do you think is most misunderstood about buyers in healthcare, whether they be in Canada or in the US? Like, what is the difference between who is actually buying your product and what is different about their motivation?
Well, in Canada, there's just the government. And it's interesting, I also have my two cousins from Denmark are in the room. They're visiting me this week. And so it's been interesting to me, like, understanding the incentives and like how you actually improve outcomes in a public health care model. I think companies like Scandinavian countries have done a much better job of it. And I think that Canada actually looks to Denmark. I think they kind of try to learn from the Danish healthcare system. So Canada, obviously being public, government, one buyer. In the US, there's just like a fragmented landscape of potential buyers with different incentives. The hospitals are also for profit, and so there's just far more groups that you need to work with, align incentives with. That also means there's more problems to solve. So there's actually like more opportunity probably at the same time. You can kind of like capture some sort of wedge in the US market and then build out from there. Whereas in Canada, it's just a little bit more straightforward, but also takes much longer. And the incentives are, unfortunately, Canadian health system is, they just don't have a lot of budget.
Yeah, in the US, and they're all very money motivated, and and if you can show a little bit of ROI, you have their attention. Versus in Canada, you have to have enough ROI to have their attention for like 2 years and like hopefully make it through multiple cycles of whoever's in those roles, and it's rough. So on actually running a fundraise, what's one thing that you think founders should change about how they run their process today? Or that you would recommend someone do if you knew they were running a process?
So I would say a good approach is a couple of investors giving feedback really, really early helps a process immensely. So like if you're thinking about fundraising and you approach your first few conversations as like, I'm just looking for feedback, and then you can say, you know, I'm planning on running a process in like a couple months or something like that, then often investors will be more willing to take a conversation and sort of offer feedback, and then there's less of a like decision-making thing or context that's happening in that conversation. And then what I would say, and this is tricky because it doesn't always work, is running a tight process where you say like, okay, I have my long list of folks, I've done everything I can to organize all of my materials. I have like an A++ data room. You know, I've done the work to like build out FAQs or Loom videos, or like there's lots of different ways to come across impressively during a fundraise. I would say like that is something that I see a lot of founders make the mistake of, is like trying to kind of be a little bit cool in the fundraising process and raise on hype. And it's like, so let's say you have like, I don't know, a single deck and you're like, oh, sorry, I don't have anything else, or, you know, everyone's super interested. Like, that won't work with us. It just
it doesn't work in Canada,
like,
I feel like.
And so I would say like, and part of it is like, it's a reflection of the founders, their preparedness. Like, so we're evaluating things based off of how you show up for a fundraise, whether you answer questions in a certain way, you know, how quickly you respond, like those kinds of things actually are always kind of being evaluated. And so you have your long list of folks, and you have a rough deadline, but don't set it in like some really unrealistic way either. We move relatively fast for the Canadian ecosystem. I would say like we'll make a decision often in like a week or something like that. A lot of Canadian groups take like
months,
3 months to do pre-seed investments. And what that means is like if we're leading, it'll be a quick process, but sometimes, you know, most of the time you want to raise from multiple VCs, so you want to have a nice little syndicate of investors. And so even when we're leading, other groups will be looking at the round. And if you set the deadline too soon, some groups will be like, I won't be able to meet that. They won't think, oh, this is a competitive fundraise, I should like race to get this deadline. They'll actually be like, I can't meet it.
So they won't invest their resources.
They won't invest the like first, you know, first few folks on their team doing research in the opportunity. So typically I would say having like a 6 to 8 week goal and being like, yeah, we're hoping to close on like that kind of timeline tends to work with most groups, and then makes them feel a little bit of pressure, because if they don't feel any pressure at all, then they will just take their time.
For sure. Like velocity and momentum is important on both ends.
Yeah.
Like you as a founder want an investor that's taking this seriously and wants to close like quickly and get this moving and like give you the freedom to build your company afterwards with the money they give you. And then as VCs, you want a founder that is moving quickly and is going to beat everyone else in the market, hopefully. All right, and maybe a final specific question on the fundraise. A lot of founders have a hard time telling their story, or tell their story, for example, in chronological order instead of the way that's easiest to understand. What's a signal that a founder can pay attention to that tells them maybe it's time for me to rethink how I'm telling my story?
a signal for founders to pay attention?
Like if everyone's saying, wait, so what are you doing again, or why are you building it this way? Like, are there certain questions that means maybe maybe your company is fine and like your idea is great, but you're telling the story wrong?
So, something to note as founders is VCs are not the brightest bulbs. We benefit from. We're often generalists, and so our backgrounds are diverse but not deep, and especially not deep in your specific area of expertise. And there are many exceptions to that. I would say there's lots of generalist investors that have deeper areas, and they go deep here and less deep here, but then they're still investing generally. And so they really benefit from like very basic level setting about like status quo. So like, this is the problem that I experienced. These are the pain points. And this is why my solution makes sense. And so I would say the questions, if you're getting a lot of questions around problem and solution, that's probably because the investor doesn't have a really deep background in that space, which is very normal. And unfortunately, I don't want to disparage VCs, but we can be a little bit lazy too. So when that happens, we won't do the work to actually talk to someone who is in the space and be like, how does this work? A lot of the insights that founders are building off of don't exist on ChatGPT. Like, how does this actually work? If you ask ChatGPT that, those unique insights aren't going to come up. So you actually need to talk to experts, which is a lot of what we do during diligence, but we start talking to experts after we've decided we're investing some resources. And so that level setting is the thing that like gets or piques investors' interest, I would say. And so just don't assume that like investors have tons of context in your space.
For sure. So one question to wrap up. I wish I was as brave as Amin and would ask a rapid fire, but there's no chance that Katie or I could do rapid fire. We're too wordy. So one
Steph is like, shut up.
No, I mean it's for myself. So what's one company that you passed on that you still think about or that you regret passing on?
Oh man, it's funny because when we were preparing for this, there was a company. Now there's another one. Basically, there was a company that I just raised. Okay, it's interesting.
A lot of regrets.
No, like not tons, honestly. I would say, so there's one company that I'm thinking of that was a few years back, and it was kind of a hypier situation at the time, but the valuation was, I want to say it was somewhere around like 10 million or something like that, maybe 10 or 12 US, post money, no revenue, kind of a deck, like very hypey fundraise. Founders seem pretty strong, so we spent a bit of time like trying to understand the space, but we didn't love how they were approaching the fundraising, and they ended up going through YC. And then they just announced like pretty big fundraising. So I was like, this was today. I was like looking at my LinkedIn. I was like, interesting. They've completely pivoted since the initial idea.
As YC companies do.
Way, like I don't even think they're in the same like ballpark that they started in. And it's in the hypiest like space of AI right now. And so I was kind of like, maybe nothing has really changed about the way that they do fundraising. Something I find interesting is the way that they are building their business or thinking about fundraising, if that makes sense. Something I'm finding strange in this like AI world of building and investing is like you can fundraise based off of hype if you're in the right place at the right time for a pre-seed company. But you can actually do the same thing if you're a Series B company.
It's crazy.
So as much as I was feeling regret, wasn't necessarily like feeling...
There'll be another one.
Yeah, exactly.
It's funny, so when we were prepping, I thought of a company and I had it in mind and I was like, I'm going to
I did too. I had another one and I can't remember it right now.
But this is also a recent news. So when I looked at them, they were a Y Combinator company and they were raising $3 million at $30 million, pre-product, pre-revenue, 2 18-year-olds that dropped out of their freshman year of MIT. And then they raised a $30 million Series A 1 year later at a $300 million valuation. So I was like, wow. And we came really close to investing. But it came out last week that it was fraud.
Oh!
Delve. And they were building a compliance platform that was like an AI compliance platform for becoming HIPAA and SOC 2 compliant and ISO. And it was fake, so thankfully it didn't invest. But it happens all the time in the startup world where you're like, you see companies raising and you're like, wow, I really missed out. And there's something, there's a reason you missed out on it. But they're also good companies that I missed out on.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say, like, if you're 18 years old, like I actually talked to a 15-year-old a couple of weeks ago who was building a company.
I love that.
Made me feel kind of bad about myself. But I would say if you're 18, like, again, that outsider persona, I think Kozla's whole thesis is outsiders, right?
Yeah.
That outsider persona, if you're someone who works high velocity, you love learning, your learning loops are really strong, so you're always integrating information, whatever. I've met some really cool, very young founders. But I also think that they're more likely to be the
mistake makers, the big mistake makers. I
don't know.
I think
maybe that's unfair.
No, it's not, but I mean, it's like, it's easy to make mistakes if you haven't worked in an industry before, or like thinking something's okay to do when it's not okay to do.
Yeah, I also think
but also more creative when you're younger, often.
Yes, I do think that's true, and you're more willing to take more risks. I think because you have less, less to lose, I guess. Yeah. So you haven't. Yeah.
So with that, we'll take any questions that you have for Katie. There's one in the back, so maybe if you could speak, we can hear you actually. So.
On the startup side, I guess I understand how subsidies in Canada can affect startups, and I'm curious on the VC perspective, like VCs in Canada versus US, being subsidized by the government, can support public funds. How does that affect? Because I think that'll help people understand the difference.
So like LPs?
By subsidized, you mean like grants, like a startup having grants? I mean, I work at a venture fund that has one LP, which is family office, which is really fun for me. But if I look at it a little bit differently and I think of like, how do I look at startups who've received grants in Canada versus that might have received grants in the US and how that makes me think of the company? I think in Canada, we have, especially in Quebec, there is the most free money out there than basically anywhere else in North America to build a company. So seeing a company who took advantage of hundreds of thousands of dollars of grant money to get really far ahead before they ever take on dilutive funding is a huge plus. But at the same time, if I see a company that's taken on like a good amount of non-dilutive funding but kind of crawled forward, that also is a bigger negative than if they never got grant money to me in the first place. So I think for me, there's no grants basically in the U.S., so there isn't really an issue there. But I think seeing someone be efficient with capital, no matter whether it's dilutive or not, is the biggest thing for me.
Yeah, so I would say, I very much agree. I think Canada has a lot of capital available, and that does impact the quality of companies that still exist at pre-seed and seed stage. And I see this in the positive way, where if you have too much company, that really benefits the best companies. But then I think also at the same time, Canada's a bit of a fragmented tech ecosystem, and so companies can get pretty far along, like getting funding from non-dilutive sources or VCs, and still kind of be not quite on track.
Yeah.
And so, because you do a lot of U.S. investing, I do a mix. So we look at a lot of in the U.S. We do like maybe 30%. Usually Canadians building in the U.S. But I would say, like LPs in Canada being like largely government, so there's lots of capital. This is like really positive, I think, in a lot of ways, and like BDC is like very across the sort of ecosystem of funders in Canada. But then I would also say like just more competition to get to the seed stage in the US means that the seed stage companies kind of look better at a surface level. A seed stage company in the US has maybe pitched like 300 VCs, and Canadian companies that have like pitched 40 of like the main groups up here, you know, in some cases you'll get really amazing feedback. In other cases, VCs will just kind of like do the soft, you know, sorry, this isn't going to work for us, and then you don't really learn from that, right? And so I find that the Canadian or the US companies we talk to at Seed, sometimes like they're better at pitching, they're better at telling their story. Their companies are more competitive, apples to apples, if you compare them to Canadian companies, and that makes me kind of sad sometimes. But then, at the same time, if you're like really holding yourselves to a high bar in Canada, then you're benefiting from like everything, because you get access to like all of the like tech talent subsidies, the shred, you get access to like all of the capital that Canada has, and so the best companies in Canada, I think, are very well positioned. And there's been many examples of like amazing companies built in remote places in Canada, which I think is kind of proves that point. Like Newfoundland has had one of Canada's biggest exits with Verafin. We have a great company in Saskatoon. And so holding yourself to a high bar, I would say, is like the most important thing, because it's hard to change the ecosystem of funders. Sometimes spending some time in the Valley is important, but I'm a big like building Canada.
It's more fun to live in Canada too.
Yeah, I'm being Canadian is like awesome. So
Yeah.
I've got a lot of Canadian pride.
Any other questions? Yep.
You mentioned that the cycle and expectation were maybe shorter cycle, higher expectation, smaller team. Have you seen an increase in funders burnout or exhaustion, and how do you react to that?
An increase is an interesting question. I would say what maybe more than what I've seen is expectation setting is really challenging right now for founders, because it's hard to know if you have the metrics necessary to have a successful fundraise. It is a little bit of a Wild West right now in terms of, you know, seed plus like getting funding, and so founders will be like entering the market and they think they're really well positioned to fundraise, but a lot of the capital, even though we're kind of like deploying a lot, it's getting concentrated in the AI, foundational AI or AI native companies. And so sometimes like if you're right in the middle of that, what's it called, dartboard,
Bullseye?
Bullseye. If you're in the bullseye for that, then you really benefit. And if you're slightly outside of it, founders will be like, I have amazing metrics, I'm going to raise an amazing round, blah, blah, blah. And it just won't go the way they want it. And so I think that is impacting morale a bit, because they've worked so hard, they've worked through challenges, and then they're just like not fitting into the pattern matching that a lot of VCs just kind of have a point of view about the stuff that they're investing in right now, and that just impacts the supply and demand for capital, which impacts, you know, your ability to run a competitive process, your ability to close the round period. On the early stage founder side, I would say maybe slightly less burnout, because the founders can use like different tools to support admin, which admin is like one of the biggest drags as a founder. Like, and there's just lots of tools that are, founders are building to help them do that kind of work.
For sure, I agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Since you both invest not just in Canada, I'm assuming you take a lot of meetings online. So what is the trigger point of I'm going to go meet this founder, if there is one? Where is it? And then do you typically see big differences from what you experienced virtually with a team versus what you will then get in person?
Interesting.
Yeah, big difference if you meet them in person. Honestly, I would say it's very hard for me to have a coffee conversation with a founder and not walk away being like, wow, that was the best company ever.
I always get so excited.
Smart. And so I would say I recognize that in myself, actually. So often I will do the first meeting over Zoom for that exact reason.
Some self-control.
If I'm really interested in the space, sometimes I'll do a first, or maybe they're very early. If they're very early, then sometimes I'll do a first meeting in person, because when we're doing really, really early stuff, it's about the way the person thinks. So you're just doing a lot of, conversational stuff. And so I would say super, super early, like I'm thinking about building, maybe I'd be more likely to do a coffee. And then if they have a deck, it's just easier to do that over Zoom. But I would say post deck, like meeting in person usually is a signal of strong interest. Our team comes here, I want to say once every 2 months or something like that. And so if there's a company that I really like around that timeline and I pull the whole team in to meet them in person, then that's like a pretty urgent signal from our team, at least, that they're pretty deep in the process. We won't usually require a founder to go to Toronto or something like that and meet Michelle, who's the founding partner of our firm. I'm the office in Montreal, but if it lines up, then that's usually a really strong signal.
Yeah, I agree with you, especially the feedback conversations like you described, like when a founder is really early in raising and they're like, I just want some feedback or something like that. I try to do those in person, because first of all, you understand, I think, intention a little bit better, and the vibes are more, you understand the vibes a bit more. But yeah, I think in the interest of time, if we did all our first meetings in person, we would just always be doing first meetings, and they would always be an hour and a half long.
Yeah, that's the other thing.
You gotta keep them
that's the other thing.
sometimes.
My discipline on in-person coffees is not the best, and so I usually if I do 45 minutes, then I need to leave hour and a half in my calendar just in case. But yeah, you almost always walk away from talking to a founder. Founders are interesting, passionate people. Every conversation is awesome. And honestly, I feel that way on Zoom a lot of the time too, but I would say in person, it's almost always a good feeling, even if it doesn't end up being the case that the investment is something that we would look at.
Yeah. I would say I don't think it's ever happened to me before where I got to the stage of meeting a founder when I wanted to invest, and the in-person meeting is what made me not want to invest. It's usually having found something else, because typically, if they make it that far ahead, we have conviction in person at that point.
So I started investing during COVID, so it was remote investing. There's one company I can think of where I think we would have benefited from
an in-person meeting. We won't name them, I guess.
No. Sometimes you can see things in real life that you wouldn't have, and in fact, okay, not to just whatever, but if there's relationships between co-founders or things like that, sometimes those things you can't see unless unless you have in-person meetings, or, there's other things that you can tell as well, like dynamics between co-founders, like power dynamics, like, if there's 3 co-founders and they're equal ownership, alternatively, one might have 2%, and then there's 2 that have most of it, and when you're in person, you really feel like there's a major difference, and you don't get those feelings over Zoom as much. For us, we invest in companies led or co-led by women, entirely returns-driven thesis. We think women make amazing founders. We think teams that have some diversity, so even one woman on the founding team, like, impacts the culture, the way companies get built in a really positive way. And what that means is that it's important if the woman is still involved with the company in like 5 years. So those dynamics are important for us to see when co-founders are interacting. If the woman is like less important, like, obviously, different co-founding dynamics exist, but for us that makes it less interesting.
That makes sense. Yeah, there's a question behind. Yep.
So you talked about defensibility in the beginning. So for context, I'm building in women's health, which we know is like underfunded, under-researched, all these things. And yes, there's like a little bit more traction and awareness now. I mean, like 5 to 10 years, I imagine we're going to be uncovering some of like the basic truths about some of the conditions, conditions that I'm looking at, right? And that's very different than, let's say, looking at like AI tools, how they're working now. I feel like it's a little bit different to be able to project what tools we're using now are going to affect the way that we work. Whereas building now, a lot of it is going to be based on what we uncover from like a medical perspective. What would you look for in terms of like that critical thinking bucket?
I would say, so thinking about defensibility is important. If you're building in med devices, or you're building in like digital health, or you're building even in biotech or whatever else, like the way we think about defensibility in health is, I mean, there's lots of different ways that you think about it, but we like the spaces you're describing, where maybe there's an edge in terms of understanding, the founder has an edge in terms of understanding like the kind of data that's going to be valuable in the future, the kind of data that isn't being collected today, the kind of like things we're learning about. So for example, let's say in the menopause space, a bunch of drugs were being developed that help menopause. Then potentially that would make a treatment selection company in the menopause space look more interesting. Those drugs aren't quite developed yet, but your timing is really good, so we're always evaluating timing. If you have unique access to data and you're able to build models around that data, if you have longitudinal data and there's value to the longitudinal kind of data in women's health, like, I think that's always valuable. If you have consumers that are, there's feedback loops around and like incentives, they give you data and that compounds your sort of data advantage with the models that you're building. I'm just like spitballing different examples, but like I would say the biggest risk areas for us are not necessarily in health for like the AI commoditization stuff. It's the work that gets done digitally we worry about, but healthcare isn't a digital thing. Like our bodies are like physical things. We have to do things to collect data, like different devices can collect different data. That data helps us build better models. So it's very different. Like if work happens purely in a digital way, then in 10 years that work could look very differently. Like, for example, there could be a world where documents are just no longer a thing, right? Like the world could be entirely voice first. Maybe building in health, taking that approach is valuable, but you can't solve problems in health without interacting with the real world. And so I think that's why defensibility looks a little bit different. And I think we don't do a lot of med devices, but if you do have sort of like the data at the point of like capture, I guess, if you have a device that does that and you're kind of the only one that does it, then I think that can be interesting and defensible too. But yeah.
Interesting, super well put. With that, we're going to wrap up, but I would invite you all to help me in giving Katie a huge round of applause for her time and insight.